The auction nobody wanted, the alien slave market, was a place of noise, heat, and cruelty. Chains rattled, traders shouted, and the smell of fear hung in the air. All around, buyers moved from cage to cage, looking for strong workers or pretty faces. Every cage had desperate eyes staring out, hoping someone would choose them. But in the far corner, away from the crowd, sat one girl nobody wanted. Her small frame was covered in torn clothes, her skin showed old scars, and her hair was messy and tangled. She didn't beg, didn't cry, didn't even speak. She sat on the cold floor of the cage with her knees pulled to her chest. The other slaves avoided looking at her, and the traders had stopped calling out her price long ago. People whispered about her. Too damaged, one said. Too difficult, another muttered. She bites, she fights, she's not worth the trouble, the trader grumbled. So she sat alone, invisible in a place full of eyes. Then, through the crowd, a human man walked in. He wasn't like the other buyers. No fancy clothes, no smug smile. He wore a simple jacket, dusty from travel, and his boots were scratched from long journeys. In his hands was a small crate of supplies, food, tools, and medicine. He had come to trade with the market for spare parts, not for slaves. But as he passed the cages, his eyes caught hers. For the first time in years, someone didn't look away. He didn't see the scars. First he saw the way she sat, tense but proud. He saw her eyes, dark and watchful, like she was ready to fight the whole galaxy. He stopped walking, and the noise of the market seemed to fade. The trader noticed his pause and laughed. "You don't want that one, human," the trader called out. "She's trouble, been here for years, can't be tamed." The man didn't answer. Instead, he stepped closer to the cage, crouching down so he was at her eye level. She stared at him without blinking, her expression hard. The man's voice was calm, almost gentle. "Do you want to leave?" he asked. Her eyes narrowed. This was a trick. It had to be. She had heard lies before, promises that led only to pain. "She won't come," the trader said with a shrug. "You can have her for free. Just to get rid of her. Nobody else will. Take her." The man didn't even think about it. He set the crate of supplies down and pulled out a small device, a payment chip. "Open the cage," he said simply. The trader blinked. "You're serious? You'll take her?" "Yes," the human said, his tone leaving no room for argument, with a roll of his eyes. The trader unlocked the cage. The door swung open with a squeak, but the girl didn't move. She had been in cages for too long to believe freedom could be real. The human didn't step inside. He just knelt down, resting one hand on his knee. "I'm not here to hurt you," he said softly. "You can walk out, or you can stay. It's your choice." Her heart pounded in her chest. Every instinct told her not to trust, but the way he looked at her steady, patient was different from every other face she had seen. Slowly, she unfolded her arms, her hands trembling, one step forward, then another, until her fingers were just inches from his outstretched hand. The moment her skin touched his, something inside her shifted. The cage was no longer her whole world. He stood, still holding her hand, and guided her out into the open air. The other slaves stared. The traders muttered, but the human didn't care. He led her away from the noise and the smell of the market. Each step felt unreal to her, like a dream she might wake from. She didn't know his name, didn't know where they were going, but for the first time in years, she wasn't walking alone. And though she didn't understand why, she felt that maybe, just maybe, this human might be the one person in the galaxy who truly wanted her. Asterisk, the trader still wore a mocking smile as the human led the girl away. "Don't say I didn't warn you," the trader called out, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "She's more trouble than she's worth, human." The man didn't even look back. He kept walking through the narrow paths of the market, his hand still gently holding hers. The girl's steps were slow and unsure. Her bare feet felt strange on the rough ground outside the cage, Every sound made her flinch. A shout from a vendor, the clank of metal, the hiss of steam from a food stall. She kept her eyes low, afraid to meet the stares of strangers. The human noticed but said nothing, giving her the space to breathe. They reached the edge of the market where his small transport ship was docked. The ramp was lowered, and the smell of machine oil mixed with the faint scent of food from inside. He stopped at the bottom of the ramp and finally spoke again. "My name's Rian," he said. Her lips pressed together. She didn't answer. "That's all right," he added gently. "You don't have to talk until you want to." Inside the ship, the lights were soft and warm. It wasn't big or fancy, but it was clean. Rian set down his crate of supplies on a table. Then he turned back to her. "You're safe here," he said. Safe. She thought bitterly. That was a word she hadn't believed in for a long time. She looked around like a cornered animal, her eyes darting to the door, to the small windows, to the tools hanging neatly on the wall. He noticed and stepped back, showing her the controls by the hatch. "You can leave any time," he said. "I'm not going to lock you in." Her chest tightened. Nobody had ever said that to her before. Still, her stomach growled, and she hated herself for it. Rian went to the small kitchen unit, pulling out a pack of ration bread and a container of stew. The smell filled the air, making her mouth water. He set the food on the table and sat down on the other side. "Eat," he said simply. She didn't move. Her eyes narrowed, searching for the trick. In her past, food had always come with a price: work, pain, or worse. Rian noticed her hesitation and, without a word, picked up a piece of bread. He took a bite himself, chewed, and swallowed. Then he set it back down. "See? Not poisoned," he said with a small smile. Her hand twitched, and finally, she took the bread. She ate slowly at first, her eyes still fixed on him, but hunger took over, and soon she was eating like she hadn't in days. He didn't rush her, didn't speak, just let her eat until the tension in her shoulders softened. When she was done, she leaned back, still silent. Rian studied her quietly. "You've been through hell," he said softly. She looked at him sharply, as if daring him to say more, but he didn't ask questions, didn't demand her story. Instead, he said, "You're not my servant. You're not my property. If you want to stay, you stay because you choose to." Her throat tightened. This was dangerous, she thought. Hope was dangerous. She didn't trust him, not yet, but his words planted something small inside her, something she hadn't felt in years. A sudden noise outside broke the moment. Shouts, footsteps, the sound of a heavy engine starting. Rian's face hardened. He moved to the control panel and checked the ship's scanner. A group of armed men were moving toward the dock slavers. By the look of their heat signatures, they saw me take you, Rian said, his voice calm but firm. "They want you back." Her blood went cold. Every muscle in her body screamed to hide, to curl up in a corner, but Rian was already moving, closing the ramp and powering up the engines. "They're not getting you," he said simply. The girl stood frozen, her mind torn between fear and disbelief. He didn't have to do this. He could hand her over and avoid trouble, but he wasn't even considering it. As the ship's engines roared to life, she felt the deck tremble under her feet. Rian glanced back at her, his voice steady. "Buckle up, this might get rough." For the first time since she had met him, her lips parted. She whispered her first word to him, barely audible over the engines. "Why?" Rian didn't hesitate. "Because no one else did," he said. Then he pushed the throttle, and the ship lifted off into the sky, leaving the market and her old life behind. The stars stretched endlessly outside the small ship's windows. The hum of the engines was steady, almost calming, but the girl sat in the corner of the cabin, her knees drawn up, her eyes fixed on the floor. Rian had offered her one of the passenger seats, but she refused. She didn't trust chairs. They made it too easy for someone to trap you. The human didn't push her. Instead, he piloted the ship with quiet focus, occasionally glancing her way to make sure she was still there. After a long silence, he said, We'll stop at a safe port tomorrow. She didn't answer. It was strange, he wasn't filling the silence with questions. He wasn't demanding to know her story, her name, or what she could do for him. That alone made her uneasy. Everyone always wanted something. When the ship entered autopilot mode, Rian stood up. "You must be tired," he said. She kept her eyes on the floor. "There's a cabin you can use," he continued, pointing down the narrow hallway. Her body stiffened. Closed spaces made her think of cages. He seemed to notice her hesitation. "You can leave the door open," he added. "Nobody's going to lock you in." She didn't move right away. But when he returned to the cockpit to check the navigation, she slowly walked to the doorway he had pointed at. The cabin was small but warm, with a narrow bed and a blanket neatly folded on top. It smelled faintly of metal. And something clean. She touched the edge of the blanket. It was soft. Her fingers tightened around it, like it might vanish. That night, she lay down but didn't sleep. Every creak of the ship made her eyes snap open. The sound of Rian moving around in the cockpit kept her alert. At some point, her exhaustion won, and she drifted into uneasy dreams. But the dreams turned dark, hands grabbing her, chains pulling tight, voices laughing. She jerked awake with a gasp, her chest heaving. Rian was standing in the doorway, his hands empty, his expression calm. "You're all right," he said softly. Her eyes darted to the open door. No lock, no barrier. She sat up, trembling. "I wasn't going to touch you," he added quickly. "I just heard you call out." For a long moment, she stared at him. Then she whispered, "You didn't come closer." "No," he said, shaking his head. "I figured you'd want space." She didn't know what to make of that. Every person she'd met before had crossed her boundaries without asking. This human stepped back. She didn't thank him, but she lay back down, leaving the blanket pulled up to her chin. Rian lingered in the doorway for a moment longer, then returned to the cockpit, and for the first time, she realized he wasn't guarding her. He was giving her freedom. The next morning, the smell of food woke her. She stepped into the small galley to see Rian cooking something in a portable pan. "Morning," he said, without turning around. Her eyes flickered to the food, eggs, a rare luxury on most ships. "Sit," he said, sliding a plate toward her. She hesitated, then took the seat farthest from him. They ate in silence, but halfway through, she noticed something odd. He was letting her take the bigger portion. Her eyes narrowed. "Suspicious." "Why?" she asked suddenly. He looked up, confused. "Why? What? Why give me more?" "Because you need it more than I do," he said simply. She didn't know how to respond, so she just went back to eating. Later that day, as they drifted through quiet space, Rian found her in the cargo bay. She had discovered his repair tools and was fiddling with a broken panel. "You know how to fix that?" he asked. She shrugged. "Maybe." In a few minutes, the panel lit up. Fully repaired. Rian grinned. "You're good." Her cheeks heated, not with shame this time, but with something unfamiliar. Pride. The hours passed slowly, and by nightfall, she found herself in the cockpit, watching him work. He didn't chase her away, just nodded toward the co-pilot seat. She sat down, still unsure why she was staying. But part of her liked the quiet hum of the ship, the way the stars drifted by. She liked that he didn't look at her like a problem to be solved, but like someone who belonged there. That night, when she returned to the small cabin, she left the door open, and as the engines purred in the background, she realized something she had never thought possible. This was the first night in years where she wasn't sleeping in a cage. The next few days passed in a slow rhythm. Rian piloted the ship, checked their course, and traded at small, out-of-the-way stations. The girl, still refusing to share her name, spent most of her time in the cargo bay, or sitting quietly in the cockpit. She was always watching, always listening, but slowly, the stiffness in her shoulders began to fade. One afternoon, as they traveled through a quiet stretch of space, the ship's warning light flashed red. Rian cursed under his breath. "That's the stabilizer again." He stood and started heading toward the engine room. before he could open the access panel. The girl stepped forward. "I can fix it," she said, her voice steady. Rian blinked, surprised this was the first time she had offered to do something. She knelt by the panel, her fingers moving quickly over the latches. Inside, the wires were old and some connections were loose. She pulled a tool from her pocket, one she had taken from the cargo bay days ago, and began to work. Rian watched her silently, noticing how confident her hands were. Within minutes, the warning light turned off, and the ship's hum smoothed out. She sat back, wiping her hands on her torn sleeve. "Not bad," Rian said with a grin. She didn't smile, but she met his eyes for the first time without suspicion. "You've done this before," he guessed. She gave a small nod. "Machines don't lie," she murmured, almost to herself. Rian understood machines didn't hurt you, didn't betray you. From that moment on, she started helping with small repairs. If a panel flickered or a tool went missing, Rian knew she was probably working on it. She was quiet, but she was never idle, and the more she fixed, the more the ship began to feel like it was hers too. One evening, while Rian was adjusting the ship's navigation, a signal popped up on the scanner. Multiple vessels moving fast. He frowned and zoomed in on the readings. Slaver ships. His jaw tightened. "We've got company," he said. The girl froze where she stood, her hands gripping the edge of the console. Her breathing quickened. Too many memories of being dragged back to a cage. "They won't get you," Rian said firmly. He powered up the defensive systems and changed course. But the slavers were gaining. "They know this sector," Rian muttered. The girl stared at the blinking dots on the screen, her fear clear. Then something changed in her expression. She stepped forward and pointed to the star chart. "This way," she said, her voice stronger. Rian glanced at her. "It's a narrow asteroid belt," she explained quickly. "Too small for their big ships, but we can make it through." He didn't question her. With a sharp turn, he guided the ship toward the coordinates she gave. The asteroid field loomed ahead, massive chunks of rock drifting slowly through space. Rian pushed the throttle, weaving between them. The girl stayed by his side, calling out angles and safe gaps behind them. The slavers hesitated, their ships too large to follow without risk. Moments later, the scanner cleared, and the danger was gone. Rian exhaled and looked over at her. "That was good work," he said. She didn't reply, but there was a spark in her eyes, something close to pride. She wasn't just a passenger anymore. She had helped save them. That night, over a simple dinner, Rian leaned back in his chair. "You know," he said, "you're more capable than half the crew I've worked with." She stared at him like she didn't know if it was a joke. "I mean it," he added. She looked away, but he could see the way her fingers tightened around her cup. No one had spoken to her like that before, not as a burden, but as someone valuable. Still, trust didn't come overnight. When he asked her name again, she stayed silent, but she no longer avoided the cockpit, and sometimes she even spoke first. Her voice was soft, almost careful, as if testing the air. Before she let the words out, the next morning, Rian found her in the cargo bay, repairing a dent in one of the storage crates. "You know," he said with a small smile, "one day, you might even tell me your name." She glanced at him, her eyes narrowing playfully for the first time. "Maybe," she said, then went back to work. But the peace wouldn't last. On the edge of the sector, another signal appeared on the scanner, stronger. This time, the slavers hadn't given up, and Rian knew they were coming back with more than just a few ships. The ship's warning sirens cut through the quiet. Bright red lights flashed across the cockpit panels. Rian leaned forward, eyes locked on the scanner. "They found us," he said, his voice calm but tight. The girl stood frozen behind him, her breath shallow. On the screen, several large blips appeared, slaver vessels. They were faster this time, closing in from two directions. Rian's fingers moved quickly over the controls, adjusting their course. "They must have tracked us from the last station," he muttered. The girl's hands clenched into fists. her nails digging into her palms. Her eyes darted to the escape pod hatch. For a moment, she thought of running, getting away from the fight entirely. But she remembered the last time she ran. She had been caught, beaten, dragged back to the cage. Her legs refused to move toward that door. Rian was already boosting the engines. The ship surged forward, but the slavers followed. A deep rumble shook the cabin as their pursuers fired a warning shot. The blast missed but lit up the black of space with deadly light. "They're trying to hurt us," Rian said, scanning for an exit. The girl stepped closer, gripping the back of his chair. "Turn toward the debris field," she said suddenly. Rian's eyes flicked to the nav chart. "That's risky," he replied. "Half those rocks are spinning fast enough to tear us apart." "They won't follow us in," she said firmly. "They're too big." Rian didn't argue. He swung the ship sharply to port, engine screaming under the strain. The slaver ships adjusted course, trying to cut them off. A second blast grazed the starboard shields, sending a shudder through the hull. "Shields at 68%, Rian called out. The debris field grew larger in the viewport. It was a graveyard of old ships, shattered stations, and drifting rock. Some pieces were as big as buildings, others small enough to hide behind. Rian pushed the ship inside. Weaving between floating wreckage, the girl stayed beside him, her eyes scanning for threats. The slavers slowed, just as she predicted. Only 2 smaller vessels dared to enter after them. "They'll try to flush us out," Rian said. The girl's voice was cold. "Then we don't give them the chance." She darted toward the cargo bay. Rian called after her. "Where are you?" But she was already at the weapons panel, powering up the ship's rear guns. She wasn't a soldier, but she knew how to aim. The moment a slaver craft appeared between the wrecks, she fired. The blast struck its side, sending it spinning into a chunk of asteroid. It exploded in a flash of light and debris. The second ship returned fire, forcing Rian to swerve hard. The hull groaned under the strain, alarms blaring in the background. "Nice shot," Rian called out. The girl didn't smile, but she loaded another charge. The second slaver darted behind cover. Using the wreck of an old battleship as a shield, Rian twisted the ship through a narrow gap, engines roaring. "Hold on," he shouted as they scraped past jagged metal. The slaver reappeared ahead, its cannons glowing. Before it could fire, the girl unleashed another blast. The shot ripped through its forward shields, sending it spinning out of control. It collided with a drifting freighter hull, breaking apart in a burst of fire. For a moment, the debris field was quiet again. Only the hum of their engines and the faint ping of cooling metal filled the air. Rian slowed the ship, breathing hard. The girl set the weapon controls to stand by, her hands trembling slightly when she returned to the cockpit. Rian looked at her with a mix of surprise and respect. "You're full of surprises," he said. She shrugged, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Pride. It was the second time she had helped save them, but their escape wasn't over. On the far edge of the scanner, the larger slaver ships were waiting. "They're trying to block the only exit from the field," Rian said. The girl leaned over the console, studying the map. "There's another way out," she said, quietly, pointing to a narrow cluster of rocks. Rian frowned. "That's barely wider than the ship." "Then you'll have to fly well," she said, her tone almost challenging. Rian grinned. "Hold on." The ship darted forward, weaving through the maze of drifting debris, sharp turns, narrow passes. Sudden drops. It was like threading a needle in the dark. The girl stayed steady beside him, calling out distances, warning of spinning metal. Finally, they burst out into open space. The slaver ships were far behind now, unable to follow. Rian powered down the weapons and let the ship drift for a moment. "We made it," he said. The girl didn't answer, but she didn't look away from the stars either. Somewhere inside, a piece of the old fear had broken and something stronger was taking its place. Asterisk. The stars outside drifted slowly now. The engines were running low and steady, no longer straining under the chase. Rian sat in the cockpit, eyes fixed on the quiet expanse ahead. Behind him, the girl stood near the doorway, her arms crossed loosely. For once, her posture wasn't tense, it was almost calm. She had been silent for hours since their escape. Rian didn't push her, letting her thoughts settle. Finally, she stepped into the cockpit and sat in the co-pilot's chair. Her gaze lingered on the stars. "They won't stop," she said quietly. "They'll keep coming for me." Rian didn't look away from the controls. "Then we'll make sure they can't find you," he replied. His tone was steady, like he was talking about fixing an engine instead of protecting a life. The girl studied him for a moment. She had heard promises before, but they had always come with a price. This time, it felt different. Later, in the galley, she found him, repairing a cracked piece of hull plating. "Why are you doing this?" she asked. He didn't look up. "Because I can." "That's not an answer," she said, her voice sharper. He put the tool down and met her gaze. "Because you deserve better than what they gave you," he said simply. Her throat tightened. She wanted to tell him everything, but the words caught in her chest. Instead, she asked, "Do you want something from me?" Rian raised an eyebrow. "No." She didn't believe him at first. Nobody helped without wanting something. But days had passed, and he hadn't asked for payment. Work or obedience, that was a chain she had been forced to wear all her life. And he was the first one who didn't try to put it back on her. That night, she lay awake in her small cabin. The hum of the engines was like a heartbeat under the floor. Memories flooded in her capture, the cages, the whispers that she was worthless. Her fingers dug into the blanket. Then she heard a faint knock on the open doorway. Rian stood there, holding a steaming cup. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked. She shook her head. "Me neither," he said, stepping inside just enough to hand her the drink. The warmth seeped into her hands. "You ever thought about where you'll go when this is over?" he asked. She shook her head again. "I don't have anywhere." He nodded slowly. "Then maybe we make somewhere," he said. Her eyes lifted to his. He wasn't offering her a cage, or a job, or a bargain. He was offering her a choice. It was a strange, fragile thing, but it was more than she'd had in years. The next day, as they traveled toward a distant colony, she finally spoke the words she'd been holding back. "My name is Kayla," she said quietly, almost testing the sound of it. Rian looked over, a small smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Kayla," he repeated. "That's a good name." She hadn't heard anyone say it kindly and so long that her chest ached. From then on, she moved through the ship differently. She still kept to herself sometimes, but she also worked beside him without being asked. They fixed the coolant leak together, adjusted the navigation system, even cleaned the storage compartments. Every task she completed made her feel less like cargo and more like part of the crew. But the shadows of her past weren't gone. One evening, as the ship floated in a quiet sector, Rian found her sitting alone in the cargo bay, staring at the floor. "You all right?" he asked. "They took everything from me," she said, her voice low. "I had a family once, I think," she added. "It's hard to remember their faces." Rian didn't tell her to forget or to move on. He just sat beside her in the silence. Sometimes, that was enough. 2 days later, the colony came into view, a bright green and gold world, its surface glowing under a warm sun. "This place is far from slaver roots," Rian explained. "They can't touch you here." Kayla stared, headed through the viewport. It looked peaceful, almost unreal, when they landed. The air was fresh and filled with the scent of flowers. The settlement was small, but busy. Rian led her to the local registry office. Within an hour, her new identity was official Kayla. Free citizen, no owner's mark, no chain, no price tag, walking out into the sunlight. She stopped and turned to him. "You really meant it," she said. "Of course," he replied. She took a deep breath, the air filling her lungs like it belonged there. For the first time in years, she felt light. The chains were gone, not just from her wrists, but from her heart. The colony's morning light spilled across the dusty streets. Children ran between the small houses, their laughter echoing in the air. Merchants opened their shops, setting out baskets of fresh fruit and tools. Kayla stood in the middle of it all, her eyes wide. It felt strange to be somewhere that wasn't dangerous. Somewhere that didn't smell of chains and fear. Rian walked beside her, carrying a small pack of supplies. He moved with ease, greeting a few locals with a nod. She noticed how they looked at him with respect, not suspicion. "Do they know you?" she asked quietly. "Not yet," he said, "but they will." They stopped at a small, weathered building on the edge of the settlement. It had 2 rooms, a sturdy roof, and windows that caught the sunlight. "It's not much," Rian said, "but it's safe, and it's yours if you want it." Kayla blinked, unsure if she had heard him right. "Mine?" she asked. "Yes," he replied simply. "A place to call your own." Her heart pounded. She had never owned anything before, not even the clothes on her back. Her fingers brushed the doorframe, feeling the rough wood. It was solid, real, and hers. She turned to him. "Why are you doing this?" she asked again, the same question she had asked days ago. His answer was the same as before. "Because I can." Inside, the rooms were simple bare walls, a small table, and a bed. To anyone else, it might have seemed empty. To her, it was a palace. She walked slowly, touching each wall. The silence in the room wasn't heavy, like in a cage. It was peaceful. For the first time, silence didn't mean danger. Over the next few days, they worked together to make the place livable. Rian brought tools, food, and blankets. Kayla cleaned the floors, fixed a loose window frame, and even planted a small patch of flowers outside. The work was tiring, but it felt different. It felt like building something instead of surviving. One evening, as the sun dipped low, painting the sky in gold and red, they sat outside on the small porch. Kayla watched the children in the distance playing some kind of game with a ball. Her gaze softened. "They're not afraid," she murmured. "No," Rian said. "And you don't have to be either." She was quiet for a long moment. Then she said, "Back in the cage. I used to think I'd die there." Rian looked at her, but didn't interrupt. "I stopped hoping," she continued, "because hope hurt more than the chains." Her eyes met his. "But you gave it back to me." Rian didn't give speeches. He simply said, "You gave yourself back to we. Just open the door." The words hit her harder than she expected. She turned away so he wouldn't see the tears that threatened to fall. That night, the air was warm, and the stars shone brighter than she had ever seen. Kayla stood outside alone, looking up. For years, the stars had been reminders of everything she couldn't reach. Now, they looked like a path one she could choose to follow. Behind her, Rian stepped out, holding 2 mugs of tea. "You thinking of leaving already?" he teased lightly. She shook her head. "No. I'm thinking of living." In the days that followed, Kayla began to change. She walked through the settlement with her head higher. She traded for her own supplies, learned names, even smiled. Once or twice, the people began to greet her like she belonged there, and slowly, she started to believe she did. One morning Rian came by with a small mechanical device. "I thought you might like this," he said. It was a broken radio, something simple but intricate. Her eyes lit up as she turned it over in her hands. She set to work repairing it, and within an hour, it was humming with static. The pride in her chest felt good safe. When she looked up, Rian was smiling at her, not because of the radio, but because of her. Weeks later, a transport ship passed through the colony. It brought news from other worlds, and whispers of slavers still searching the outer sectors. Kayla listened without fear. She knew they might still come one day, but she also knew she wasn't the same girl they had caged. She had a name, a home, and someone who would stand beside her. On the morning Rian prepared to leave for another supply run, Kayla walked him to the docks. As he was about to board, she stepped forward and took his hand. The gesture mirrored the first day they met, only now her grip was strong and certain. Come back, she said. Always, he replied, and as his ship lifted into the sky, Kayla stood in the sunlight. Her heart was steady, her chains were gone, she was no longer unwanted. She was free, and this time, the galaxy would have to see her for who she truly was.